Okay. Basic literacy and ESL. This is a distinction that we apply to our students to determine the context of their literacy education. What's the difference between basic literacy and ESL? Well, a basic literacy student grew up speaking English, but needs to build more skills so they can reach their goals, whatever these may be. An ESL student, ESL stands for English as a Second Language, grew up speaking another language, and English is, as the name suggests, their second language. Within these categories, there's a lot of variety in skill and understanding. So these distinctions are just jumping off points for really knowing your student, especially their cultural background. While not always the case, an ESL student typically immigrated to the area from another country, whereas a basic literacy student is from United States, usually here, Rio Arriba. But it is important that you get to know your student's culture beyond what these terms tell you, so that you can make the most of their existing literacies as you guide them towards English literacy skills that they desire. In this module, we're going to look at how one's culture creates multiple forms of literacy and how these literacies can be instrumental to the acquisition of English literacy. As with all the modules in this training series, this will be a general introduction. We expect you will want to seek out specific techniques and tools to meet more particular needs of your student, and RALP will be updating its training modules regularly with shorter follow-up trainings to help you acquire these techniques. But let's move into culture. There I am in the corner, and let's move to culture. Now, culture is going to be the organic life inside the mechanical structure of this language that you're teaching. It lends vitality to meaning and contexts. But culture is also very difficult to pin down. On one hand, there are many aspects of culture that are obvious, and you can see that in this diagram here. You have the behaviors and practices, the norms. But the question of why these aspects exist in the first place, what's beneath the surface, that why is a much, much bigger topic with a lot of different factors. Just for your own sake, take a look at one of the practices unique to your own culture. Why do you do that? Take a minute to think about it. Pause the video. Identify a cultural practice that you participate in. It could be something small, like how you greet someone, and give a list of the reasons behind why you do it in that exact way. Pause. Take 2 minutes. Just write down a few of the reasons why you do that. So how did that go? I bet you could have gone on and on, giving reasons for reasons, doing research into ancestry and history. Culture goes very deep. So let's look at how that depth can impact a student's experience of English literacy. We're going to look at two phenomena in particular: culture shock and code switching. Culture shock is the feeling of disorientation or confusion that occurs when a person leaves a familiar place and moves to an unfamiliar one. This is particularly pertinent with ESL, as the student has recently, or in the more distant past, come to the United States from a different culture, and the literacy implications are clear. I mean, as the ESL student needs not only to understand the words and phrases we use in the United States, but the reasons why we use those particular words and phrases in context. Otherwise, they won't be able to understand the meaning. And you can see this diagram. It's really a wave that's constantly fluctuating. You get up to acceptance, but then you find a new aspect of the culture that you don't understand, and you're back to doubt. So it's up and down over time. So your student is going to be experiencing this as they go. On top of this, and or in addition, there's code switching. And because there isn't just one culture in Rio Arriba or the United States. So it is possible to experience cultural disorientation or difference if you're a basic literacy student who is from here. Cultural norms and the reasoning behind certain behaviors can vary from space to space. Say, you're at the MVD, and then you're at Walmart, and then you're at a community event, and then you're at a job interview, and then you're with your family, and then you're in school. To move between each of these places requires some amount of what is known as code switching. That's the practice of shifting the languages you use or the way you express yourself in your interactions. Now, there's an equity element to these terms because someone from the culture with the most power and privilege in a society does not usually need to code switch or experience culture shock to survive in this society. And I want to play, I want to play a video. Let's see if this will play.
Code switching as a concept is really interesting. By definition, it's what happens when people who speak multiple languages alternate between two or more, oftentimes within the same phrase or sentence. In a more colloquial sense, code switching is what happens when people reflexively or subtly change the way they express themselves. So for someone like me, and I'm sure many of you all here, I thought up until about 4th grade that y'all was the correct contraction for you all. It was only after some point at around 9 or 10 that I learned that you all was the correct way to address a group of people, and that I should absolutely use you all, not y'all, when addressing important people and situations. As our world continues to be connected through technology of all sorts, apps and the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence, I guess code switching makes a lot of sense as people from different backgrounds continue to come into close contact with one another. But when we look more closely at code switching and who's expected to make the switch, we discover a hidden reality. And that reality is that the expectation of code switching threatens true diversity. My first day of 3rd grade was at a new school, as I had recently been accepted to the gifted program, which meant that I would be bused from my neighborhood school of Westside to Tomoka in the next city over. The year was 1992, and so on the first day of class, I proudly donned my favorite Jodeci pleather new boots and my cross-color short set. To say that I stuck out like a sore thumb would be a grave understatement. My new classmates were in polite pastels and ribbons and bows and Kids Gap and Limited 2 fashions. I knew immediately that if I was going to fit in and make friends, I would have to change more than just a few things. So over the course of the next few years, I learned acutely how to do just that. I stopped wearing my Jodeci boots. I started choosing softer colors as opposed to the bright hip-hop colors and fashions that I had chosen previously. I started listening to Green Day, and I eventually learned how to act like my new classmates and eventual friends. Most importantly, though, I learned how to align myself not just so that I fit in, but so that I was culturally compatible. And I didn't know it then, but this is where I learned how to code switch and how to behave and speak in a way that made me a non-threatening person of color. As our society grapples with police brutality and protests against such violence have become synonymous with big brand ad campaigns and pop culture, it's a person's behavior which indicates whether or not they have learned the language of effective code switching. There have been countless instances in recent history where a person's ability or inability to code switch has meant the difference between life or death. Are you all familiar with Henry Louis Gates Jr.? Many people know him as the host of the PBS series Finding Your Roots, and still others may know him as an esteemed Harvard professor. Still others of us may remember him also from a 2009 incident involving Cambridge, Massachusetts police when he was arrested for breaking and entering into his own home. No doubt his ability to articulate and him being who he was and being able to explain the situation led to a relatively okay outcome for him, save the public humiliation of being arrested. For those who opt for authenticity, unapologetically deciding to speak with the accents of their homeland or their grandparents, or to wear their hijab, or to say y'all in the boardroom, there are oftentimes very real consequences that can be felt. Consequences like not getting that promotion because the client wants to speak to someone who sounds American, or being jeered at for wearing symbols of pride from your culture while other people who appropriate that same culture make the pages of Vogue magazine. Or being told by HR or administration that your natural hair is inappropriate for work or school and will need to be changed to avoid disciplinary action. For those who aren't even deciding against code switching because they haven't learned it, the consequences can be even bigger. When I was a kid, I heard a lot of talk about Oreos. And I'm not talking about the delicious cookie sandwiches eaten best with a glass of milk, but I'm talking about the slang term, which refers to a person who's black on the outside and white on the inside. Kids definitely have a way of putting things plainly. But the concept always made me think a lot about myself, who I was and who I was becoming, where I lived and where my friends lived, the music I listened to at home with friends and family versus the music I was starting to listen to with my new friends at school. Deep down, I always felt like I had to hide certain parts of myself that I knew were still very much me. I had to be careful to not slip and say something too ghetto in front of my new friends, but I had to also be careful to not talk too much about cello or classical music when I was at home. For the person who's expected to code switch, to exist almost simultaneously in 2 or 3 different worlds, constantly presenting a slightly edited version of self, the pressure can be immense.
You can watch the rest of that video at your leisure, but just for our case, we'll stop there. So you can see how code switching does take a toll, and it can be disproportionate where that toll is taken. And because of this, well, before we get there, I want you to think about these topics in your life and how code switching, how you code switch, or explain your culture. In what spaces do cultural norms match with your own? And what spaces are they different? And how does that impact your effectiveness in these spaces? So pause the video and ask yourself these questions. Maybe write for 5 minutes on this subject, or 10, and then play again. So use this exercise that you just did to empathize with your own students' experiences, asking themselves, how often and in what situations does your student code switch or need to code switch or navigate culture shock? And how is that impacting their experience and their ability to learn? When you think about the amount of work required in code switching and navigating culture shock, you can imagine that all this work does help to build a unique set of skills. ESL students have had to navigate an incredibly complex international immigration system, take calculated risks in moving between countries, find their place within this nation. Basic literacy students learn to achieve many goals without relying on some of the literacy skills most of our society can take for granted. But your skills don't just come from their challenges and frictions with society. Your students' existing culture, interests, and life path has taught them many forms of language, many literacies. Take some time to learn and learn from your students' literacies. I mean, if you're confused in what I mean about other literacies, take some time to think about literacies in your own life. Here we have a diagram with a bunch of literacies that are not English literacy. See? Think about the things that you could not do if you didn't understand the language specific to that task. This language is not inherently English. For example, there is a Starbucks literacy. You need to know what Frappuccino and Grande and half calf mean if you want to make your order. There is computer literacy, where you need to learn how to operate the software and use the filing system. And yes, these can involve English, but again, English is not inherent. So pause, make a list, see how many literacies you can identify in 5 minutes where English is not inherent, but you use on a regular basis. So, how'd that go? Maybe you found a lot of literacies, and you may note that these literacies often coincide with your culture or the cultures around you. Maybe, though, you had a hard time distinguishing where English literacy ended and this other literacy began, and that's fine too. See, your English literacy informs and supports all those other literacies, which all blend into your culture, just as your culture informs those literacies and your English literacy. So the same is true for your student. As you teach, use your students' existing literacies, their existing cultural understanding to support the development of their English literacy. Let's look at how the understanding of your students' culture and literacies can support their tutoring. Listen to this passage and prepare yourself to answer a comprehension test. Okay. 4 zups in common use for pabbing, the wabbing power of aparta mediums, are the basic parta curve sieg, the interval sieg, the hot break sieg, and the z sieg. Okay, so you ready for the comprehension questions? What is the purpose of the siegs in the passage? Why do you need to pab the wabbing power of the parta mediums? How do you perform the basic parta curve sieg? So pause the video and see if you can answer any of these. So I hope you didn't spend too much time on that because, of course, how can you? You don't know over half the words, and this is what happens if you just teach phonetics. Your students can read the sounds, but they still don't know the words. Now, that isn't to say that phonetics are irrelevant. Phonics are irrelevant. They can be really helpful with dyslexia, early stage learning, just making sure that you're saying it right. But this exercise demonstrates their limitations. But if you teach your student all the words they don't understand, that helps. Now here's the same passage again, but with the real world words in place of the nonsense words. 4 methods in common use for evaluating the cooling power of quenching mediums are the basic cooling curve test, the interval test, the hot wire test, and the magnetic test. And here are the same comprehension questions as before. What is the purpose of the tests in the passage? Why do you need to evaluate the cooling power of quenching mediums? How do you perform the basic cooling curve test? Pause the video and see if you can answer these now. So you probably did better than before, but I don't expect you have enough context for anything more than a pretty superficial answer. And of course, this is just a short excerpt, so maybe if you'd understand more if it was longer, but I want to ask, why would you be reading this text in your session? Why would you choose to read a chapter in a textbook titled Heat Treating, Cleaning, and Finishing Metals in your tutoring session? Now, this is not a rhetorical question. Pause and think, what are some of the possible scenarios when this text might make sense? Right, so maybe your student is in a class on metallurgy. Maybe they have a strong literacy surrounding the processes of metallurgy, and all they need is help with the phonics and vocabulary support. Or maybe you have metallurgy literacy and they want to understand metallurgy. Then your tutor session will include extended discussions about metallurgy in addition to reading support. Just like culture, a text is so much more than what you see, the words on the page. You have to have literacy and cultural awareness for what those words are about. And this is why when you are teaching your student, it's important to understand where your student is coming from, what their interests are, what they already know. If you start with what they have, you won't have to start from nothing. The previous slide is an imperfect example because you probably want to avoid collegiate textbooks, even if your student is a metallurgy fanatic, because such texts assume that their reader has an expansive set of literacies. You want to find books and resources that meet both your students' interest and their literacy capacity. This type of text is called a high-low, as in high interest, low literacy. If you can't find a high-low resource, you can always adapt reading, say a textbook your student brings in from their metallurgy class to a more suitable reading level. But this is hard to do and imperfect because you're not an expert. As such, you probably want to look at the following resources first. You can check out our lending library. We keep this library updated with great high-low resources on a variety of subjects. So browse our library online or in person. And you can, if you browse online, you can email us with the books you'd like to reserve. Take a look. So you can go through, you can look, search. It's a reasonably small library, but compact. You can look for all the books, order one, and email us, hey, I want this book, and we'll reserve it for you. And then you can come in and pick it up. Second, you can check out Newsella. It's a free resource that allows you to adapt news articles to multiple reading levels. Let me show you how it works. Okay, so I'm in my account. And I've got it on the maximum reading level. Ultimate gift to our future generations, plan to laser math, all land on Earth. It's not easy to read, It's a hard article. So what do we want to do? We want to bring it down, maybe. Let's bring it down to the lowest reading level. So you can see how it automatically changes the reading level. Let's go back. Let's go up to the 970. Let's go back up to the maximum. And you can see how it's changing each time. Some articles have Spanish translation. So you can even flip back and forth between Spanish and English if you're an ESL student who speaks Spanish. So it's a very adaptive resource. And lastly, you can ask us to buy a resource for you. If you find something that's going to suit your tutoring sessions perfectly, then send us the link for it, or let us know how to get it. And 9 times out of 10, we'll be able to help you out, probably just buy it for you. And add it to our library, or allow you to take it home and draw on it, or whatever the resource is. Tutoring should be a custom experience. So as we conclude this module, I'm curious, what literacies did you draw upon, besides English literacy, to understand the content in this module? Anything surprising? Let me give an example for myself. I drew upon the experience of living in another country, and that helped me understand and then explain culture shock. So what's a literacy that you have learned in your life that isn't English literacy, that is facilitating your understanding of this module and these tutor training modules as a whole? All right, thanks, and send us your work from this to read@ralph.org, and we'll move on to the next module when you're ready for it. Bye.